All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And welcome to today's virtual program, Mexican American School and the Law, with Dr. Laura Munoz. I am Janie Adams. I'm the History Engagement Coordinator for the Arizona Historical Society, and I will be your host for this afternoon's program. So a little bit about the Arizona Historical Society before we get started. The Arizona Historical Society is a nonprofit educational and cultural institution and a state agency established in 1864. AHS collects, preserves, and tells the stories of Arizona's past through museums, exhibitions, libraries and archives, outreach, educational programming, and through publications. AHS preserves our past, shares our state stories, and connects people through the power of Arizona's history. So stay connected with us at the Arizona Historical Society. Consider becoming a member of the Historical Society. One of the benefits of membership is that members are mailed a print version of the Journal of Arizona History every quarter, so that's exciting. Sign up for our email list, follow us on social media, visit one of our museums, and you can learn more about all the stuff that we do at AHS by visiting us online at azhs.org today. A couple of housekeeping notes before we launch into our program. So this is a Zoom webinar, which means the host and the panelists, we can't hear you, we can't see you. So if you have comments or questions, please use the Q&A feature. This program will be recorded, and a recording will be available on our YouTube channel in a couple of weeks, 10 days. And again, if you enjoy this program, consider becoming a member of the Arizona Historical Society, and you can learn more about membership at azhs.org/membership. We have more exciting book talks. We're kind of halfway through our book talk series at this point. So in December, on the 10th, we have a book talk at the Arizona History Museum in Tucson with Melanie Martinez, a virtual program on the 12th of December, and then another book talk, this time at the Arizona Heritage Center in Tempe on the 14th of December. So you can learn more about all of our programs that are happening by going to the Arizona Historical Society website and exploring our events calendar. All right, now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Laura Munoz. Dr. Munoz comes from a family of teachers, including her maternal great-grandmother, who taught in schools in the early 1900s in Texas. She is currently an associate, Dr. Munoz is currently an associate professor of history and ethnic studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She earned her PhD in American history at Arizona State University, and we are so excited to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much.
All right, feel free to share your screen when you're ready.
Okay, here we go. Let's see. Oops, I'm in the wrong place. Let me just go back. All right, so here we are. This is my book. The title of it, Desert Dreams, Mexican Arizona and the Politics of Educational Equality. And as Janie mentioned, thank you, Janie, I came to this topic because I was interested in the history of Mexican American teachers. And I thought that that would be an easy research project when I was studying for my PhD and dissertation at Arizona State University under Dr. Vicky Ruiz at the time. And unfortunately, it was much more difficult than I anticipated. So I turned my attention to the history of Mexican Americans and education in general in the state of Arizona. And it turned out no one had really looked at this particular topic. So my project goes back in time into the territorial period to look at the ways that Mexican Americans engaged public education in the state of Arizona, then the territory of Arizona, from about 1870 to 1950. I always like to start with a map to give us a sense of place, and also with the dates to give us a sense of time. And one of the things I'd like to point out with this particular map are all of the black dots that you see under the 12 different cities that are designated here. This particular map is circa 1920, 1925, and each of these towns with a dot reported having a majority of Mexican American students in their public schools in the mid-1920s. This is based on evidence that comes from the 1918 U.S. Bureau of Education School Survey of Arizona, as well as information that comes from Arizona's Board of Education in its 1925 survey. And I'm always marvel at the fact that Mexican American children constituted and have constituted the majority of school children in many of the towns in Arizona since the 19th century. So investment in public education then became critical for this population and for the state if it wanted to educate all of its children. I also like to use a timeline to sort of ground us in this broad period from the early territory into statehood. And I want to point out a couple of different laws that were critical to the founding of Arizona schools. And of course, the first one is the 1871 territorial law for public schools. This is the law that is passed by the territorial legislature and sponsored by Governor Safford and legislative Representative Esteban Ochoa from Tucson. It's passed in 1871, and the goal here is to create an infrastructure for communities to establish schools and to use tax authority to pay for those schools. One of the things that you'll notice is that even though we create public schools, these are generally primary schools, grades, kindergarten or first grade to 8. And it's not until the 1880s and the 1890s that we formalize higher education and then high schools. And in fact, higher education comes to Arizona before the creation of high schools, because at places like the Tempe Normal School, which was the first higher education institution created, and the University of Arizona, both of those institutions offered high school level courses, or what we called high school studies in the time period. So if you completed a grade school certificate that verified that you had completed 8 years of schooling, you could enroll in a high school studies program at Tempe or at Tucson, and then take preliminary courses that would eventually get you into the college level material that both the normal school offered to train teachers and that the university offered to train students in a variety of fields. In 1895, Arizona finally authorizes high schools, and Phoenix Union is the very first high school created in the territory. Once we get into statehood, at 1912, it's at this moment that we see the idea of racial segregation codified. Initially, in terms of schooling, the goal was to create separate Black and white schools in the state of Arizona. And there was an attempt to include those laws in the state constitution that was written in 1910 in preparation for statehood. But those particular laws were withdrawn because Arizona wanted to enter the Union without this sort of cloud of slavery or former slavery attitudes, and then of course segregational attitudes, sort of marring its constitutional bid, its statehood bid in this time period. What happens after statehood, though, is that the legislature, like many of the Confederate states, goes back and reinstitutes all of those laws. So by 1913, we see official school laws that are related to segregation of African American children. And then by custom, we see the emergence of Mexican American segregation in the public schools as well. And in 1913, the city of Tempe creates what's known as its very first Mexican school, the 8th Street School. And within that time period between 1923 and 1925, the Mexican American community in Tempe is struggling to figure out ways to challenge this. In 1925, they eventually sue the Tempe Public Schools and also Arizona State Teachers College for segregating children at this 8th Street School. And then we see a whole series of conversations come out of that about how Mexican American children should be educated. Throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, Mexican Americans across the state are constantly investigating this idea of segregation and its effects on Mexican American children. And we eventually see the 1951 case of Gonzalez v. Shealy that will pave the way essentially for desegregation of the entire state in 1952. So it's this broad time frame that helped me sort of enter into this conversation about Mexican American children and their education in Arizona. I argue that Mexican Americans, which I also refer to as Arizonenses, developed their own educational pathways. And they did this through a project they called civic integration. Civic integration basically implies this idea that a person could remain and practice cultural values related to their Mexicanness, but also embrace the pathways of citizenship that the United States offered in the time period. So civic integration becomes a way for Arizona Mexicans to embrace not only a cultural identity, but a political identity as an American. This allows them to participate in Arizona society. They know the school laws, they build schools according to those laws, they encourage education, and they eventually cultivate a recognizable professional class that will come to include teachers, lawyers, and politicians who are working not only to educate children, but to uphold and sustain their civil rights and their citizenship rights in the state of Arizona. I wanted to look at three particular themes today. Those include these ideas of educational investment, how Mexican Americans helped create the public school system, what the rise of Jim Crow looked like as Juan Crow and the segregation of Mexican children in the early 20th century. And then finally, this idea of Mexican American civil rights and the role of Arizonans, Arizonenses, in shaping broad civil rights for Mexican Americans across the United States. So let's start with Esteban Ochoa. Esteban Ochoa is an important figure. He's the richest man in Arizona Territory in the 1880s, and he has an alliance with Governor Anson P.K. Safford, because not only is he a representative of Tucson to the Arizona Territorial Legislature, he's also a very well-known businessman, and because of that, the businessman in the state of Arizona, along with his partner, Pinckney Randolph Tully. And Pinckney Randolph Tully and Esteban Ochoa basically make a deal to invest in public school education and also private school education. In fact, Esteban Ochoa finances the very first school that's built for Tucson, the Tucson School District, which is the old Congress Street School that you see here. He actually pays for the building, he pays for the materials. His men who work with his freighting company actually bring all of the material, the wood essentially, down from the mountains into the town of Tucson to help build this particular school. And then it becomes the official Tucson public school. At the same time that he's investing in this public school, his partner Tully and his wife, who's also Hispana, her name is Maria Trinidad Conklin, the two of them agree that they want to finance private schools in Tucson, particularly the Catholic schools. And so Maria Trinidad Conklin and a number of her girlfriends, who are also married to wealthy men, both white and Mexican, in the city of Tucson, agreed to bring the Sisters of St. Joseph to Tucson, and they set the foundation for establishing private schools. Both of these together became important to help set up territorial schools, because in the public schools we see the creation of an English-only academic curriculum. In the private schools, we see the creation of bilingual academic curriculums, and both of them are not only financed by the Mexican American community, but also the children of that Mexican American community attend both of these schools simultaneously. One of the most important Mexican American families in the state of Arizona that created public schools and were instrumental in the creation of a place like Arizona State University. It includes the Sotelo family. Historian Christine Marin has done a lot of work around the heritage of the Sotelo family, specifically Manuela Sanchez Sotelo, who you see here in the inset. She's considered the first non-Indian woman to come to Tempe in the 1870s. And she comes there because her sons and her husband earned water rights of way as a result of participating in the building of essentially the Tempe dams and irrigation systems in that particular region, which essentially become in the future the Salt River Valley system. So Manuela Sanchez, because she owns this claim to water right of way, comes into Tempe, establishes her own ranch, files for her own homestead, and brings with her her 11 children. One of those children, who you see here on the far right, is Maria Sotelo Miller, and she actually marries the next door neighbor, a guy by the name of Winchester Miller, who is pretty well known in Tempe history. And he becomes one of the very first trustees of the Tempe Public Schools, known as Tempe School District 3, because it is the third school district created in the state. Their 10 children attend the Tempe Public Schools, and then subsequently, at least 6 of their children enroll in the Tempe Normal School once it is created and built. And Manuela Sotelo is important in this particular story because her family argues that she donated property because her particular land holdings came up to the corner of University Drive and Rural Road, and that section of land was originally part of her property, that she donates a portion of this land to the Tempe Normal School. She also helps contribute cash along with her daughter and her son-in-law, Winchester Miller, to help fundraise the $500 necessary to build the original land that will eventually create the Tempe Normal School in Tempe. Their granddaughters have preserved this history, which we talk about as oral history, but also importantly as sort of these unknown stories that have not been included in the official record. And so they become important to helping us sort of rethink the ways that Mexican Americans engaged in school building and community building in places like Tempe. Throughout the state, in fact, parents could establish school districts as long as they paid taxes and lived 2 miles away from the nearest school. So a community could literally apply to its county for the right to create a public school as long as the nearest public school was 2 miles or more away from their community. This allowed Mexican American parents to create a number of small rural schools throughout the state. And you'll see here from this list of early teachers and superintendents that Mexican American families were very involved, not only in educating their children, making sure that they completed the 8th grade, and then eventually complete high school studies, and then eventually take the teaching certificate exam so that they could return to their communities and work as teachers in them. Amelia Hunt Garcia and Monico Garcia, who came from the town of St. John's, are great examples of this. Amelia Hunt, who comes from an Anglo-Hispano family, is what I believe to be the very first person of Mexican heritage to earn a teaching certificate in territorial Arizona. And she spends the majority of her career from about 1890 until 1936 teaching in the St. John's area in small schools, including places like Concho, but also in the larger towns like St. John's. And eventually both Monico and Amelia go on to become the county school superintendents of Apache County. One of these famous teachers is named Aurelia Borges de Wentoff. And if you're familiar with her and you know anyone who has a photograph of her, I would love to be in touch with you. I've never been able to find a photo of her, but her work becomes critically important in the early 20th century. She's what I believe to be the earliest known Mexican-American woman to attend the Tempe Normal School in the early 1890s. And after she graduates from the Tempe Normal School, she goes into teaching and teaches at the US-Mexico border. And after a few years of teaching, she decides that she wants to embark on a new career, and she begins to write textbooks on how to teach Spanish to English-speaking children, but also how to teach English to Spanish-speaking children. Not only does she teach on the US side in Arizona, she teaches on the Sonoran side as well, and spends literally the first probably 15 to 20 years of her career teaching in both Mexico and the United States. Once she marries, that's where we get the went off from. She moves to California, and during this time, she begins to write these particular books, and they become so successful that they are adopted as the official primers for Spanish language curriculum in the state of California, and they also get collected at major libraries like the New York City Public Libraries, and this is the reason why I have examples of the texts because they are now in the public domain and shared at websites like Coffee Trust, which is a collection of primary sources. If you're interested in taking a look at what they have to offer, you can access that for free on the internet. By the time we get to the 20th century, Mexican Americans are moving into the region. I should say Mexican immigrants are moving into the state of Arizona. Some of that as a result of the Mexican Revolution, but also because many Mexicans had historically lived in the region before the 1848 US-Mexican War. And so we see movement in that second half of the 19th century within this Mexican community that's going back and forth across the border between Sonora and Arizona. As that population grows in size in the state of Arizona, alongside the growth of the Anglo-American population, we begin to see the emergence of racial tension. And teachers, particularly principals, begin to question whether or not Mexicans are invested in education. And so the Arizona Teacher and Home Journal, which is a statewide magazine that records topics of interest related to education, begins to document the condition of the Mexican American child. And this one example from R.E. Summers, who's a principal or superintendent at the Douglas schools, raises this question: does it pay to educate Mexican children? Because Mexicans are believed to be indifferent to education, and it's pretty tough for American institutions to begin this process of assimilation. This particular argument becomes the basis for early segregation of Mexican children in the Arizona public schools, and it becomes a rationale for segregating children into schools that will teach them specifically how to speak English and specifically how to enter into vocational education. The goal is to educate the child with enough English skills to work, if they're young girls, as domestics, if they're young boys, in the mining institutions or other service professions. Mexican American education in this time period takes on what one scholar, one sociologist calls a spider web, or the silken strands of education. Mexican American children, because they're not officially segregated by law in the way that African American children are, oftentimes are thought of as being outside of traditional segregation. But what we find when we take a closer look at the idea of Mexican schools is that Mexican American students are often segregated in schools in ways that resemble African American Jim Crow segregation. This begins as early as 1912. It takes place at the primary and grammar school levels, so basically between grades 1 and 8, and it's dependent completely on local conditions. What do community members think about race relations in their town, and if they are opposed to racial mixing, or they see Mexican Americans as potentially threatening the education of their own children, we see families, particularly Anglo families, beginning to argue for segregation. This means that Mexican children then become segregated in Mexican schools, where they take on this vocational remedial curriculum, and they're often taught by Mexican American teachers. So we see Mexican American men and women find themselves also segregated in these Mexican schools, teaching children of their own heritage. In other places, this looks white. Sometimes Mexican American children are able to enter traditional public schools without any question about race, share the same classrooms with Anglo-American children, enroll in high school, go to college, employ the academic curriculum, and eventually find themselves, if they become teachers, teaching in schools that serve all kinds of children. So for Mexican American youth, segregation in some ways takes on this mirage effect. Sometimes it looks like traditional Jim Crow segregation at the turn of the 20th century, but then there are times where Mexican Americans can slip through segregation and take advantage of the opportunities that US society offers, particularly when it comes to sharing white spaces with Anglo school children. Mexican schools, on the other hand, become important in places where we see the economy shaping racial distinctions. So here's two examples of Mexican classrooms. One of these is a Gilbert school district number 41, the first grade of Mexican pupils. This particular community, of course, in this time period, this photograph is circa 1920. This is a rural community. So the majority of Mexicans living in Gilbert in the time period are working in agriculture and seen as farm workers, and their children therefore find themselves segregated in the local public school. Mexican American parents tolerate this kind of segregation, and they do so because there are laws in place that require students to attend schools, and oftentimes school officials would send the local sheriff and also other officials, school officials, to these parents' homes to seek out their children. Why are their children not in school? So then we see parents consenting to segregation in places like Gilbert, where they feel like they have no power. In other places, like the town of Ray, which was a mining community, in this particular community, there were two twin cities, one named Ray and one named Sonora. At this particular copper mine, majority of the miners were Mexican. The owners of that particular copper mine created a Mexican enclave and called that enclave Sonora, and built for those children their own Mexican-American segregated school. You'll notice that the school, which you see in the background, is really quite nice, and that's a reflection of the fact that the copper companies actually invested in paying for these segregated schools, and they were often state-of-the-art facilities. And we see this taking place in Douglas and Miami Globe, where in Miami in particular, the Bullion Plaza School is an example of what a premier vocational Mexican school might look like in the early 20th century. Mexican American children reported that they experienced different types of segregation, and this really had to do with the fact that segregation shifted for Mexican American children depending on local conditions. These are the children here of the Reverend Esau Perez Munoz, who had a Methodist congregation in the town of Tempe. He also traveled across the state of Arizona in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, opening Mexican Methodist missions. And his children, as a result, had the opportunity to go to schools in almost every town in the state of Arizona, from Yuma to places like Flagstaff, to Miami Globe, to Tempe, to Phoenix. The Munoz children, who are not related to me, by the way, experienced various forms of Mexican school segregation. Elizabeth, who you see on the far right here, described this experience in different ways. She said that in some towns, like in Miami and Turkey Shoot, she was in mixed schools that had both Anglo and Mexican children, and that those children sat on separate sides of the same classroom. In other towns, she was in all Mexican schools, like in the town of Tempe at the segregated 8th Street School. In other towns, she was either in an all Mexican room, and those schools had all Mexican or all Anglo classrooms. And then eventually she attended predominantly white schools. In fact, she was able to attend, both she and her sister Lucinda were able to attend Phoenix elementary schools, and they were admitted into what we think of as traditionally Anglo or white schools because they spoke enough English. Eventually, they earned an 8th grade certificate, and that 8th grade certificate becomes their pass into predominantly white high schools, in this case, the Phoenix Union High School District. And all of the Munoz children, in fact, graduated from Phoenix Union High School in the 1930s. At the same time, Phoenix Union High School had a segregated colored school. So Mexican-American children are maneuvering between both white and Black structures of education within the state. In 1925, the Romo family in the town of Tempe begins to challenge the status quo segregation of their children. As I mentioned to you at the beginning of the talk, this had been in place since 1913. And even in that time period, Mexican-American parents had encouraged the town to reconsider this idea of segregation, but the local school district refused. And so over the next decade and a half, they're trying to figure out how they could challenge segregation. And of course, that challenge was tempered by World War I, and of course, an economic bust in Arizona in the early 1920s. So the Mexican-American community is dealing with national issues at the same time that it's dealing with this question of segregation at the local level. Eventually, by 1925, Mexican-American parents, represented by the Romo family, agree to file a lawsuit. And the Romos are significant because the mother of the family, Joaquina Jones Romo, that you see here, is a daughter of Anglo-Hispanic heritage, and her father is actually Dr. Jones, considered the very first medical physician in the state of Arizona. So she comes from a family that has a well-known history, a well-known past. Her father was also, in addition to being a physician, a school board member. So she has political power in some ways because of her family heritage. Her husband also worked for Dr. Jones and helped manage the family homestead, including some ranching endeavors. And so the Romos had this sort of pedigree, if you will, that allowed them to challenge the status quo of segregation in this town. They filed their lawsuit in 1925, and over the course of that 25-26 school year, the courts argue with the parents and also with the school district about this situation. One example of that is a feud that takes place between Mrs. Peralta and Governor Hunt, both of whom had roots in Tempe. And Mrs. Peralta is important because she's the only person whose voice appears in this particular lawsuit. She actually writes a series of letters to Governor Hunt, which are in the Arizona State Archives, and filed under the idea of segregation. And in these letters, she begins to ask the governor to intervene in the situation that's emerging in the town of Tempe. And she basically tells him that her children are devastated, that they come home crying, they can't believe they've been segregated in their town, and she wants to know what the governor can do to help not only the town of Tempe, but Mexican Americans in general across the state. Governor Hunt, unfortunately, has very little to say to her, and explains that as governor, he really can't intercede in legislative matters. And so over the course of 3 to 4 letters, they argue back and forth about this. Eventually, their correspondence deteriorates. Mrs. Peralta is very upset. Governor Hunt is upset with her tone, and they don't come to a resolution. But she's able to basically say that there's an issue here, that Mexican Americans have a right to education, that Mexican Americans should not be subject to segregation in the way that African Americans are, and that the state should defend the interests of Mexican American children. What we find in this particular lawsuit is that the local county courts eventually agree, and they argue that, I should say the Maricopa County court argues that Mexican American children should not be segregated in the local public school, and that those children who would like to attend what is known as the 10th Street School in Tempe or the Anglo-American School should be allowed to matriculate there. As a result, a number of Mexican American youth from the town of Tempe are able to enter into not only Tempe Union High School, but also the normal school. So we began to see a number of students leave the Mexican school, the 8th Street School in Tempe, and garner the same public school education as Anglo children by enrolling in the 10th Street School. This happens only for a sliver of children in the town of Tempe because as part of the legal negotiation, the judge also grants the Tempe public schools an opportunity to maintain segregation as long as certified school teachers work in the 8th Street School. Then Mexican American children are meeting the requirements of Plessy v. Ferguson and Jim Crow laws. And so that segregation, that separate but equal segregation, is legitimate and legal. And so we see a split in the Mexican American community in Tempe. Those who come from families that have some wealth, like the Celayas, and Chris Celaya is a great example here, are able to participate in traditional Arizona education, enroll in the 10th Street School, and then subsequently enroll at Tempe Union High. And this is an example of him from 1917. Across the state, there are a number of Mexican American youth who are also taking advantage of the opportunity to go to high school. And I include here a sampling of Mexican American youth who did so across the state in places like Jerome, Phoenix, and Winslow. And I point out George I. Sanchez here at Winslow High School in 1922 because George Sanchez becomes a very famous Mexican-American educator who challenges the notion of Mexican-American school segregation throughout his career in the 30s, 40s, and 50s when he becomes a professor at the University of Texas. These high school grads are also exemplified by other families in the state of Arizona who are part of what we might call the Mexican American elite. These children here are the children of James Barney Sr., who graduated from Stanford, who worked as an engineer for the city and state of Arizona, and who eventually became known as an unofficial historian of the region. And his children, who grow up in the town of Phoenix, attend Phoenix Union High School. They come from a mixed family. Their father is from an Anglo-Hispano union. Their mother is an immigrant from Mexico, but all three of the children, including another brother, managed to graduate from Phoenix Union High School in the 20s. James Jr. will go on to become a very well-known athlete at the Tempe Normal School and eventually a coach at that institution. And both he and Ernestine will teach for decades, not only in Phoenix, but across the Southwest in places like New Mexico and Texas. A lot of these youth, if they can make it to high school, find themselves entering colleges. So here's a sampling of Mexican American women who attended either Northern Arizona University, the Tempe Normal School, or the University of Arizona in the 20s and 30s. You'll notice the name Celaya here for Maria Celaya Escalante. She's related to Chris. And then, of course, other famous women like Maria Urquidez of Tucson, who becomes a well-known educator. She graduates from the Tempe Normal School in 1928. A lot of the young people that go to college, whether they're going to the U of A, NAU, or ASU, are often attending university with their siblings or with their cousins. And Maria Urquidez actually followed her cousins Evangeline and Genevieve to the Tempe Normal. This became important because it gave parents some security about the safety of their daughters. And as you know, chaperonage was very important in Mexican-American families. Supervising daughters was critical to preserving their honor and the honor of the family. And so daughters often attended these institutions together as one way of sort of extending familial authority and control over them. Amelia and Clotilde are great examples of this, even though they attend in the 1920s. And they are, if you will, adopting flapper styles. They're also participating in traditional organizations like the YWCA, which emphasizes these particular values. I'm going to move pretty quickly now because I know we're getting close to time, but I would like to share a few more slides with you. College Spanish clubs become an important place for Mexican-American youth to get to know one another and also to help with retention at university. I include here a couple of examples of Spanish Society initiates in Tempe, and then Spanish Club members, including Amelia Vigil, who's the president of the Spanish Club of U of A in 1930. And this is a yearbook photo from the La Cuesta yearbook. At Tempe, Los Conquistadores is another example of a club that emerges. They're originally, these members, part of the Spanish club, but they want to create a club that will help recruit and retain Mexican descent youth at college, and particularly at the Tempe Normal School. So the Conquistadores form is the very first Mexican-American club at the university. They adopt this name Conquistadores because they were banned from using the term Mexican-American in their club name. So they lent themselves or borrowed the idea of the Conquistadores from what we think of as the Spanish fantasy heritage of Latinos in the region. So the conquerors then embark on this agenda to recruit more Mexican-American youth to the college and to help retain them through scholarship programs. Los Conquis really began to adopt what we think of as traditional politics by aligning themselves with a number of leaders. And this is an example of a breakfast they held with President Grady Gamage in the late 1930s. And you'll notice Ross Munoz standing at the wall here. He's not related to me, but he is one of those Muñozes that I mentioned earlier, the oldest son of the Muñoz family. And he's an important figure because not only is he a founder of the Conquistadores, he's also the very first student at Arizona State University to complete the master's degree. So if you ever look up ASU's master's degree lists, you'll see him in the #1 spot. Ross, along with the Conquistadores, goes on to teach in the public schools throughout the state of Arizona. And this is an example of his first teaching contract. He earned $150 a month to teach in the St. John's schools. And then a number of the Conquistadores who you see here also joined him, teaching in places like Concho and in St. John's at schools that had high numbers of Mexican-American youth. Here's an example of Ross teaching in the public school at Concho. At this time, he actually happens to be principal. This particular photograph is taken in 1940 by the famous Great Depression photographer Russell Lee, who came to Arizona to document the poverty of Hispano families in northeastern Arizona. And he spent a few days in Concho and in St. John's and took a number of photographs. This is one of a series of 80 that you can actually see at the Library of Congress and online today. Other famous Mexican Americans include Robert Robles, who eventually taught at the town of Flagstaff, at the South Beaver School, which was the Mexican American school. And one of the reasons I point him out is that gender politics affected the ways that Mexican American youth entered into teaching. So Mexican American men were often hired to teach the higher grades, often hired to work as principals, whereas women really tackled, unfortunately, glass ceilings, where they were teaching often Spanish language speakers at the kindergarten, first and second grade levels, and rarely had the opportunity to matriculate into higher level teaching and therefore higher paid teaching. One teacher who becomes well known throughout the state eventually is Maria Urquidez. Even though she graduates in 1928, by the time we get to the 40s, she has established herself as a well-known teacher and social worker in the city of Tucson. She works with the YWCA to help create what is now known today as Oury Park Community Center. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the YWCA, along with Maria, helped to create this full-time community center, which serves children in that particular region of the town of Tucson. Maria Urquidez, after World War II, becomes quite well known as a labor leader. She joins her local teachers union, eventually becoming the president of the Tucson Education Association and the Arizona Education Association. And she'll also align herself with a pretty important coalition of Black and Anglo-Arizonans who began to fight for the desegregation of Arizona schools in the late 1940s, just after World War II and into the 1950s. So I'll end right there. There's one thing more that I'd like to mention to you before I begin to take questions, and that is that Maria Urquidez will eventually, once the public schools in Arizona are desegregated in the 1950s, will eventually begin to advocate for what we consider to be culturally sensitive curriculums that will embrace what Mexican American children bring to the classroom, such as the Spanish language and their own cultural backgrounds. She'll begin to become an advocate for Spanish-speaking youth, and with a group of teachers in Tucson in the 50s and 60s, will begin to call for bilingual education as a public right. And so her work in Tucson is thought of as the precursor to eventually the 1968 Bilingual Education Act that's passed by the US Congress. So with that, I'll stop and take your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Munoz. So I had a couple questions come in from some AHS staff members. And so if you're in the audience, you have a question, please use the Q&A feature to submit that question. But one of the questions that came in was like a comparative history question. Can you kind of speak to how Arizona compared to other states in the Southwest or earlier, perhaps even other territories in the Southwest?
Mm-hmm. Most of the territories in the Southwest, with the exception, I would say, of New Mexico, segregated Mexican American children. Even in New Mexico, you could say that segregation exists, because what we find is that children of different racial identities attend separate schools. So we have separate schools for Anglo children, separate schools for Mexican children, separate schools for Native American children, particularly funded by the federal government, and then separate schools for Asian American children. There are times when we see poor children, regardless of their racial background or ethnic identity, really thrown into one school, especially if they're in rural communities, where all of these children happen to be the children of agricultural workers, for example. Tempe is one of these places that operated a number of rural schools, and those schools were often integrated. So we saw poor white children with poor Mexican children and poor Black children, and some poor Native American children who are outside of reservation systems matriculating at the same schools. And I think this is taking place across the Southwest, and there are a number of scholars who focus specifically on California and Texas, even places as far north as Idaho, Washington State, and in the Great Plains like Nebraska and Wyoming, where we see this kind of segregation emerge too.
Thank you. And you've shared a little bit with us your inspiration for this project. It's always so wonderful when you can tap into something that's so deeply personal. But can you talk a little bit about your research process? Did you find anything that was particularly surprising or
Mhm.
exciting?
I think one of the things that was super surprising for me was that there were so many Mexican American women who actually entered high school and who pursued teaching as a vocation. Even women who entered convents, for example, like the Sisters of St. Joseph in Tucson, for example, they operated not only a convent to enroll women as nuns in the Catholic Church, but they specialized in training those women as nurses and as teachers. And so we see Mexican American women who become nuns in the city of Tucson also teaching in the private Catholic schools. We see Mexican American women attending public schools and public universities and entering into professions across the state in public schools and even in high schools. I think one of the most interesting aspects about the public school Mexican American teacher is that if that particular teacher wanted to pursue a long-term professional career, one of the pathways that she could pursue would be teaching Spanish at the high school level. So we see Mexican American teachers teaching English to Spanish speakers and then Spanish to English speakers, either at the primary or high school levels, which I think is kind of interesting to see them as language experts, whether they're teaching Spanish or teaching English.
And that brings up kind of an interesting kind of parallel story, especially when
Mhm,
we're talking about school integration, which I think in Arizona is a really complicated, perhaps even
mhm,
underexplored topic. I mean, I attended schools in Tucson and I was bused and I
mhm.
went to school in the 2000s. So I think this is a story that is continuing. But a lot of Black teachers lost their jobs during
Mhm,
integration.
mhm.
Do we see a parallel story for Mexican American teachers, or is it because of that kind of subject matter expertise that they managed to hold on to more jobs?
So I want to answer that in two different ways. First, there definitely is a loss of employment for African American teachers, and that loss of employment does not affect Mexican American women or men in the profession in the same way. Because Mexican Americans are seen as being both of color and white, they're able to sort of maneuver through the race politics and maintain their jobs in this time period. So Maria Chiquidez is a great example of that because even though she joins coalitions and advocates for the end of segregation, she also becomes a very well-known leader as a teacher in the state. So on the one hand, she'll join coalitions that call for desegregation and work with African American women to help preserve their tenure in the local schools. But then we also see her maintain her own position and actually have her position elevated as a political figure in the state of Arizona. And we don't see that for African American women or African American men who are in the teaching profession in this era. So it is really, I think, very complicated around race and the ways that individual Mexican Americans are seen um, as passing as white, even though they themselves would not necessarily embrace that particular identity.
Yeah, for sure. There's a comment that
Mhm,
came through here, kind of thinking about other intersections of identity
mhm,
and kind of relationship status,
mhm.
for lack of a better word. Do you find that kind of married women tended to hang on to their jobs or single women?
I think that married women had difficulty maintaining their jobs. unless they taught in smaller Arizona towns.
Ah, okay.
So that example of Amelia Hunt Garcia and Monico Garcia, for example, they're both teaching at the same time as single young persons. Then they marry, and then she leaves the profession temporarily to have her family. And then after her children become school aged, she returns to the classroom, and she eventually enters politics as the county school superintendent. In 1930, she's actually appointed to the State Board of Education, and she's what I think of as the probably the earliest known Mexican American official in the Department of Education in the state of Arizona. She's also the highest ranking Mexican American official in that time period. So Mexican American women who are married and other women who are married do have ways of maintaining their professional status. I think it really depended upon the politics of the local community. Most of the women that are teaching in places like Tucson and Phoenix tended to be single women. And if they did marry, they left the profession and began their families.
Yeah. All right. One more question, kind of the wrap-up
Okay.
question
Okay.
is, where do we go from here, right? If there are folks looking to do research on Mexican Americans and education in Arizona, kind of what are the stones that are unturned, or those stories that you wish that you could pursue, but maybe it's better left to a different scholar, for example.
Mhm, mhm. Well, one of the things I tried to do in my book was to do something comprehensive that looked at different places across the state. And so we don't have this sort of deep dive into towns like Flagstaff or towns like Winslow or Douglas that tell us the status of Mexican American education in those communities. So that would be an important, I think, correction to the history. The other thing that we're seeing with newer scholars who are emerging is the study of the Chicano movement and civil rights politics that emerged in the 60s and 70s and 80s related to integration in the public schools, and also this changing curriculum. Can we create a curriculum that's responsive to ethnic identity in the late 20th century? And so there's some studies that will be coming out soon related to that, but those also deserve more exploration. I think also one of the things that would be really cool to see is a history of Mexican Americans across the school institution. So, when do Mexican Americans become principals, and what do those principalships look like? And does their ethnic identity shift or shape the ways that they approach their pedagogy, for example? I'd like to know definitely more about the history of teachers. I'm looking at teachers before World War II. I dabble just slightly in the history of Mexican American teachers in the 50s and 60s, but really through the life of Maria Urquidez, because she becomes such a prominent figure. Um, by 1960, she's a national educational spokesperson for Mexican Americans, and she's recognized across the United States. And people are surprised to know that an Arizonan Mexican American woman is responsible for the creation of bilingual education in the United States. So, publicizing that, I think, is going to be part of, my own academic journey, is to talk more about how important Arizona is and has been to critically shaping the ways that we think about Mexican American educational access in the United States, not simply in the state of Arizona, but what is it that Arizonan Mexicans have done for public education? She's a great example of that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I am going to post a recording hopefully in the next couple of weeks. Otherwise, take care, and we'll see you with the next virtual program. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.